Many of the things we are going to talk about in the next hour or so are based on what you have said, and it is my pleasure now to invite Professor Manuel Trajtenberg, who is a professor at the Eitan Berglas School of Economics in our university, also a member in the Knesset, the parliament, and I needed this symposium to spend time and talk with him and find out that actually we share the same interest about early childhood and the importance of education. And I think maybe, Manuel, you'll take Professor Heckman with you to the Knesset, and that will help to promote your idea on early childhood. So please come.
Okay, let me start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And in particular, it's a great pleasure to have some public. You see, in the Knesset, typically when we talk, there's nobody. And secondly, to have your attention for a few minutes. I mean, typically, if there is somebody in the Knesset, you know, they don't pay attention. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I think I will have a hard time convincing you that I didn't prepare the presentation in coordination with Jim. It was done independently. But you will find that there are many points of, what's happening to the sound? The sound. Okay? No? Okay? Maybe. Okay. Fine. No? All right. So I think my voice carries through, right? Okay. So what I would like to do is to present, I was asked to talk about the promise and limits of social policies. I guess that because of my current position, they expect me to talk about the limits. But I will try to convince you that there are some promises too to social policies. Let me start with a very brief review. Since Second World War, we have made tremendous strides in terms of social policies, but with ups and downs. It hasn't been a linear ascension. And it started all in the early 1940s with the Beveridge Report, which in the UK would essentially set the stage for what we call the welfare state. And many, many of the elements that we take for granted today were essentially structured back then in the Beveridge Report. This is this leap forward in the 1960s with Johnson's Great Society, the war on poverty, and a series of social rights that were legislated at the time. Again, we take them for granted. But there was a big reaction, a counteroffensive, if you wish, in the 1980s with Reagan, with Thatcher, essentially going to a reduction of government, a reduction of taxes, against the unions, privatization, a restriction of the welfare state, etc. And that had a very, very strong impact on policies. And then there is, in the 1990s, earlier on in the US, and then in the UK and so forth, what we call the New Labour, which was an attempt essentially to reconcile the principles of the welfare state with the market economy in a more sort of in a way that will recognize the problem of incentives and so forth and so on. And then we have again a reaction, if you wish, with the neoliberal kind of presidency of Bush and in the UK, Brown and Cameron, etc. So ups and downs, but it's not going back. I mean, essentially, every time there is a recognition that some of the gains of the welfare state are there to stay, but you should try to adapt to a changing environment. And then we get hit by the economic crisis in 2008. And essentially, what happens is that the world goes into a turmoil because of the crisis, the macro aspects of it, and it takes a while for social protests to erupt. And that happens in 2011. We see it in many countries, including in Israel. And it's sort of a reaction saying, okay, we got over the worst part of the crisis, now what? And that question is still hanging there, because essentially we have been stuck with very serious problems that at present don't have clear solutions. So, there is a big disappointment with growth as a panacea, because, the extent to which it trickles down is very limited. Look at the US, the lowest quintile, essentially their standard of living has not changed for 30 years, and so forth. Inequality has regained a major place in the discussion, particularly, not just the Gini, but in particularly the 100th or the 1000th upper percentile, not percentile, but, and the persistence of poverty in certain segments, social mobility, Jim talked about that. Youth unemployment has become a persistent, huge issue, but in Europe. When you're talking about 50% of youth unemployment in Spain, persistent, we are talking in France of near a third, and so forth. This is not just a blip or a cyclical problem, and you're talking about a whole generation that, unemployment is not just the lack of work. The fact that, you get de-skilled if you have any skills, and so it's going to be it's a time bomb for the next 20, 30 years. And aging, again, without a kind of a pension system that can accommodate retirement age, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the issues that are on the table, and we don't have very clear solutions to them. And what's really disappointing, and I'm saying that particularly with respect to my previous profession, to economics, there is not much of new thinking or prescriptions that you say, well, if only I could adopt them, okay, that will do the trick, and I will have a way of responding to these persistent, deep issues that we have. Essentially, there is a statement. The fiscal and monetary policy stuck. Austerity, zero interest rates. We require the government to do more, but there is a fear of big government, and nobody's willing. I'm not saying that they should do that, but I'm saying, the big government is no longer a solution. Okay, taxation. Again, there are limits to it. Redistribution. Globalization and technical change is typically blamed for part of it, at least, and it's very hard to know how to deal with it without throwing the baby with the bath water. And there is resistance of reform in Europe, which is very, very problematic. So there is a sense of discontent, no trust in the system. I think, without entering into politics, that the phenomenon of Trump and Sanders is an expression of that. Huge issues, okay, and essentially no policy response to it that will give hope and say, okay, if we only stick to that, okay, it will be okay. And it's really amazing when you think about the phenomenon of Trump and Sanders, and I think it reflects to a large extent that. Okay, and there is not only that, but also we recognize limits on the effectiveness of government. So suppose that we have the correct policies. Can the government deliver? Is the government capable as an institution of doing the things that we consider them to be right? Well, it's really getting very tough. Whenever we try to solve one problem by increasing regulation, the regulation piles up, and it becomes in itself an issue, okay? And also there is this attempt by the government, to play this game, if you wish, this cat and mouse game, I call it, with the vested interests, with businesses, et cetera, you do like that, then I will do this to prevent that, but then you find a way to overcome, and I need a further measure to counteract, and so forth. It becomes kind of a game that in the end, it's not clear whether anybody wins. The government machinery has become very unyielding, ineffective. I can tell you about that from first hand. And also, democracy can at times be messy because, there are lots of stakeholders and they want a voice, sometimes legitimate, sometimes less so. Populism is raising its ugly head in virtually every country, and it's very hard to face it. And also the issue of short horizons, which I'm going to come back to it, which has always been an issue, but it's becoming more of an issue for many reasons, and it's very hard to implement long-term policies like the ones that Jim is advocating when you have very, very short horizons. So I'm a representative of the dismal signs, that things are bad and you hold your breath, it's going to be worse. No, I'm not like that. We need a novel approach to socioeconomic policy. We need to aim not at growth per se, but at inclusive growth. And we need to retool the government and adapt it to the digital world. You need really to revolutionize the way that government makes policy and implements policy. So yeah, all that is kind of, big aims. I'm going to be much more focused, limited, and modest. Okay, within that context, what can we aim at? What can we try to do? So I'm going to focus on three sort of gradients of action, of policy. One is to focus, and what's common about these three is that, as Jim was sort of suggesting, the focus is on people, not on kind of policies per se, not on institutions per se, not on money, not on transfers, on people. And it sounds obvious, but believe it's not. So the first is to focus on occupations, and in particular on fast-growing occupations, and I will explain in a moment. The second is to indeed focus on early childhood, which is the key for true equality of opportunity, and therefore it impinges on everything that follows: inequality and youth unemployment, and you mentioned. And my field in academia is clinical change and so forth. I want to focus on human enhancing innovations as opposed to automation and so forth. Of course, I will do very little of each, and in particular, I have no time. So let me try to go fast. So in terms of occupations, when you look at the composition of the labor force, this is a projection done by the BLS for the US, how the workforce is going to look in terms of big sectors. It's clear that the fastest growing, by far, the fastest growing sector in the US in terms of occupations, not sector, occupations, by sectors. It's services, and within services, it's what we call healthcare and social assistance. Okay, that's projected to grow by 14%, okay, and it's a big chunk in absolute numbers. So the number of new workers that are going to be employed there is like something like 4 million, and the others are also in services, in other services, okay? So when you think of doing something about, how the workforce is going to look like, okay, bear that in mind, because that's the key. Okay, and what's so peculiar about this is that most of the workers in healthcare and social assistance need no formal education and have very low wages. So if we let it go like this without intervening, okay, you are going to have more and more workers, okay, that will be at the bottom of the pyramid, and sort of in terms of inequality and so forth, the result is quite obvious. So what do we need to do? So what we need to do is to upgrade the occupations. So I was struck by this example of what happened with nurses. Just after, in 1945, the wages of nurses were lower by 1/3 than the wages of female workers in textiles, in the garment industry, which is about the bottom of the bottom. Okay, it's unbelievable. In 1964, Congress passed the Nurse Training Act, and what it did is to upgrade the curriculum in a dramatic way. It required academic degrees, and in a process of 2-3 decades, okay, salaries went up, the status of nurses went up, etc. Now they are well paid in the US. They function very effectively in hospitals and in clinics, and there's more specialization, etc. Okay, and given that the number of nurses has increased enormously because of the, the emphasis on health, this is very significant. It has even macro implications. And also medical innovation, by the way, have contributed to that. So the point is that you need to do is it's a process of professionalization of large occupations, and then you will change the nature of these occupations. And in particular, you need comprehensive policies, training requirements. You need to provide for an academic infrastructure for that, and you need to expose them to STI, to science, technology, and innovation. So let me go to early childhood education, because I'm going to talk about it and those that work into it as one example of professionalizing that. So by early childhood education, I mean from birth to age 6, but in particular from birth to age 3. Most of it is done in a very informal way to this day. Nannies, private childcare that are this unregulated completely. Those that work in it is very low pay, if at all, little education required. This is what I call diaper care. Okay, just bring somebody to change the diapers, and that's what you call a child education. And so there's this huge volume of research. You've seen the tip of the iceberg in the previous slide, in the previous presentation by Jim Heckman, that it's beyond doubt that early childhood is the most important stage in life. It will determine your future. You have seen that, some of the slides, okay? And so when you talk about the quality of opportunity, this is it. This is it. It determines who you are going to be, how successful you're going to be, etc. So clearly, with the backing of that research, we can say that the most important challenge today in that respect is to invert the pyramid. Okay, the pyramid meaning how much we invest in education and where. Okay, and right now we invest very little at the very early stages, and we invest a lot more and more as ages go up. Okay, in terms of if you wish, the economics of it, it has to be reversed in terms of the returns to what we do. Okay, that's very clear. Now, I won't go through this. It's clear, you have plenty of that. I will stress, though, that you need comprehensive policies. It's not just, making an experiment here, an intervention there. Comprehensive policies is the key. You need to professionalize early childhood education or care. Okay, otherwise it won't work. The people that have to do it beyond the parents, and I'm going to say something about the parents in a moment, need to be trained accordingly. So if you do that, then you have what they call a double hit. Why? Because the professionalization of early childhood care, and there are many people doing that, will in itself reduce inequality in the medium run, and then in the long run, okay, those children will enjoy equality of opportunity, and therefore reduce inequality in the future, and so forth. Okay, so what happens, and very briefly, in Israel? Well, following the 2011 protest, the report of the commission, etc., we have now a free and universal education for children 3 and 4, but that was just the beginning. Okay, you need to, again, to professionalize those that do that, the workers. We don't have qualified personnel, we have too many kids per class, etc., etc. So it's just the beginning of what had to happen. But from birth to 3, there is no policy in Israel. Nada. Okay, essentially what we have is, one minister does this, the other minister does that, and it's really a disaster in terms of split responsibilities, no coherent policies, lack of continuity, etc. I'm not going to go through all that, you know it. Okay, so what we propose is to make a big push forward in this field. And it's essentially, it's almost like experiment from an international perspective, because we want to set up what we call an early childhood council in the Ministry of Education, under the ministry and not in the bureaucracy of the ministry, that will be responsible for budgeting and planning child care from birth to 6, including parenting, and it's indeed incredibly important. And we'll be able to set the priorities, etc., long-term plans. The idea comes from the body that I was in charge before, from VATAT, from the higher education system, that we have something like that. Of course, we need to transfer the daycare centers, but that's a minor issue right now. And it's not only that. We want to, and we are working on that, on planning integral early childhood centers, one-stop shop centers for children in that bracket that will essentially include everything. Okay, so the parent will be able, the parents will be able to go there to be trained and to be given information and so forth, and also to take care of the other aspects, be it health or welfare or whatnot. And by the way, this has very strong implications for urban design. And let me say the following. In Israel, we are now starting to build an enormous amount of new dwellings because of the crisis in housing. In 10 years, we are going to build something like 500,000 new apartments, okay? Most of them for new families. So, make the computation in your head in terms of the number of children that are going to be in new urban neighborhoods or whatever. And so what do we do or don't do now in terms of these daycare centers, or not daycare centers, these early childhood centers, Merkazim Lagil Arach in Hebrew, will really have profound implications for the future of that generation, and also for how an urban center in Israel will look like. I strongly believe that we can be pioneers in that field because of many reasons. I don't have time to expose that, but there is a good chance that we can do it. So I will skip this because there is no time. This is a whole issue. It's different. So let me just put the slide, but then no time for this. So let me say the following, because this is the promise and limits of social policy. Essentially, we have reached an impasse in social policies. I tried to describe that before, but let me even say the following further than that. Because there are no new ideas around, or because the politicians don't really want to hear, to listen to new ideas, we fall back on the old arguments. So to increase or not to increase child allowances, to increase or not to increase in employment benefits. It's really, this is the 1990s at best, okay? We don't look forward. One of the huge obstacles to implement new ideas is that these sort of policies, that are the ones I am advocating here, are by definition very long term. What you do or don't do, and you have shown, Jim, what happens, 50 years afterwards, okay? What you do or don't do have long-term impacts. Politicians are measured by what happens in the Twitter the day after they announce a policy, okay? And that's not only in Israel. That's a general phenomenon. So the big challenge is how to reconcile implementing policies that, in order for them to be effective, they have to be construed from the beginning as long-term policies, okay, with long-term effects that are not seen right away, and how to reconcile that with the political clock that is becoming more and more impatient. It's a huge issue. I will say on the optimistic side that one of the reasons I think we can nevertheless implement some of these policies is because they cut across the political spectrum. You see, a child is a child is a child. And in Israel, a Haredi child is a child as much as an Arab child, as much as a Jewish child in northern Tel Aviv. And we are really pushing for that, to form wide coalitions that cut across the political spectrum. This is one example. You know, I'm thinking of other policies as well, many of them related to skilling, in particular for those that don't go to academia later on. Okay, the market for skill formation has changed, is changing in front of us. And we in academia are not adapting quickly enough to that change. Okay, so there is a lot to do. There is a lot to do in terms of coalition formation. But I will conclude with the following. I cannot overstate the tremendous importance that the kind of work that Jim is leading and others have for policy formation. You know, the number of times, and you know, there are people here that have seen me in many occasions. You can see some of the faces here. The number of times that I took the liberty of appealing to your reputation in order to promote these kind of policies in the Knesset, in the government, and in public occasions. This is academia at its best, if I might say so, at least in economics. Okay? When you do the most serious work, and I don't know how many people here know, but you know, Professor Heckman made his fame originally as an econometrician, in methodology, in empirical research, in tools. But can he deploy it in areas that have tremendous importance for our lives? So in conclusion, what I want to say is that Jim is an example, in my view, of both being first-rate prize Nobel academician and having a tremendous impact on what our life can be in the future. Thank you.